We catch the bad guy, send him to prison, and that's the end of the story, right? Not so fast. Behind bars, these infamous criminals' lives continued, and some of them took very strange turns.
On July 22, 1991, authorities in Milwaukee were led to the apartment of Jeffrey Dahmer by a man who escaped after being held captive there. Immediately upon arrival, authorities noted a foul odor inside the apartment. On further inspection, they found crates full of chemicals, a drawer full of macabre Polaroid photos, and numerous body parts, including 5 severed heads. Dahmer was ultimately charged and convicted of 15 counts of first-degree murder and subsequently sentenced to 15 life terms, which were to be served consecutively.
I hope you can deal with what you've done.
Dahmer arrived at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin in February 1992. Due to the heinous nature of his crimes, Dahmer's case gained international attention. Therefore, in the interest of his own safety, he was placed in protective custody and held in isolation. Dahmer was also kept in shackles whenever he was out of his cell. After serving for a year, Dahmer asked prison officials to reconsider their decision to keep him in protective custody. As he had been cooperative and did not have any major infractions, he was moved out of the isolation cell and into a unit for prisoners with emotional and mental health difficulties. In this new unit, Dahmer had the freedom to interact with others. In addition to sharing mealtime, he was allowed to attend classes and sign up for work duties. Although some of the activities were not supervised, Dahmer appeared to get along with everyone. Dahmer also began spending time with prison minister Roy Ratcliffe. Ratcliffe claimed Dahmer expressed sincere remorse for the crimes he committed, even suggesting he should have been put to death as punishment. Dahmer also began taking a Bible correspondence course. It was mailed to him by Kurt Booth, who was a member of Oklahoma's Crescent Church of Christ. Booth learned about Dahmer while watching news coverage about his trial. In an interview which Booth saw on television, Dahmer proclaimed that he just wanted to find a little peace. Booth said he could tell the convicted killer was hurting and sent him the course material because he wanted to help Dahmer find peace through religion. After completing the course, Dahmer expressed an interest in being baptized. However, the prison did not have a formal baptismal tank, and nobody seemed willing to bring one in. Booth eventually got in touch with Roy Ratcliffe, and they arranged for the baptism to take place in the prison's whirlpool bathtub. Jeffrey Dahmer was baptized in May 1994. Following his baptism, Dahmer purchased 25 Bible correspondence courses, which he distributed to his fellow inmates. During this time, Dahmer seemed to maintain a ghoulish sense of humor, which his fellow inmates did not appreciate. For example, Dahmer routinely made jokes about cannibalism, molded his food to resemble body parts, and routinely warned guards and his fellow inmates that he may bite them. This behavior had deadly consequences. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer and 2 inmates, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver, were cleaning the restrooms in the prison's gym. The 3 men were alone inside the restroom for approximately 20 minutes. When the guards returned, they found Anderson and Dahmer badly beaten. Both men ultimately died as a result of the wounds inflicted by Scarver. Scarver later said he had been unnerved by Dahmer's behavior, including his habit of making his food look like dismembered bodies. Scarver also claimed that Dahmer crossed the line with a number of people in the facility, both staff and prisoners. Referring to Dahmer, he said, "Some people who are in prison are repentant, but he was not one of them." Dahmer's attorney, Gerald Boyle, believes he knew his client would be killed when he asked to be placed in a unit with other inmates. Boyle said, "Dahmer had a death wish, and I know he didn't have the gumption to do it himself, so I predicted that the day would come when he would be killed in prison."
In the mid-1980s, residents of Southern California were terrorized by the Night Stalker, a serial killer who was eventually revealed to be one Richard Ramirez. It's unknown just how many people Ramirez tortured, assaulted, and killed, as several unsolved cases may have had something to do with him. For instance, in 2009, DNA evidence connected him to a particularly brutal cold case, according to the Los Angeles Times. The remains of a little girl named Mei Leung were discovered on April 10, 1984, and it wasn't until decades later that Ramirez was finally identified as her killer. By the time he was captured, Ramirez would kill at least 14 people, and he would also be connected to a series of horrifying sexual assaults. His trial wrapped up with a unanimous decision. Ramirez was found guilty on all 43 charges against him. He was handed the death penalty and sentenced to death 19 times over. As he waited for his execution to be carried out and for his appeals to go through, Ramirez was held at California's San Quentin State Prison. Ramirez spent the rest of his life on death row. In 2013, he died, but not in the gas chamber, as he was sentenced to. The official cause of his death was complications from B-cell lymphoma. By all accounts, Richard Ramirez was no less of a monster behind bars.
He wasn't exactly the model prisoner.
Lieutenant Sam Robinson, a spokesperson for San Quentin, revealed that Ramirez would regularly perform sexual acts in front of visitors and guards. According to Robinson, Ramirez had a tendency to expose himself in front of children. In fact, after a 2004 incident involving a young girl who was visiting another prisoner, Ramirez's interactions with other people were severely restricted. Robinson explained to the Daily Beast, "All of his visits were behind a partition. He wasn't allowed to touch someone or hug them. He would also expose himself inside the housing unit to guards. We put signs in front of the cell saying he has the propensity to do that." Shelley Ramirez, the niece of the notorious serial killer, revealed that her uncle's death was a relief. Shelley was only 7 years old when the Night Stalker was sent to San Quentin, but as an adult, she visited her uncle. However, as Shelley confirmed to the Daily Beast, Richard touched himself during her visit, and he condemned her for wearing a gold cross. Afterwards, she sought counseling to help her deal with the incident. As she told the publication, "I felt really dirty and gross. I never had contact with him again."
This is a wicked world. And in a wicked world, wicked people are born.
As strange as it sounds, Richard Ramirez was ridiculously popular. While he was on trial, he leaned hard into his image as a satanic child of darkness, and people were fascinated by it. As noted by Psychology Today, Ramirez said in court, "Legions of the night, night breed, repeat not the errors of the Night Stalker and show no mercy. I will be avenged. Lucifer dwells within all of us."
I'll see you in Disneyland.
Ramirez's gruesome celebrity only continued after he was convicted. He spent a lot of his prison time responding to his fan mail and corresponding with the scores of people who wrote to him. As Psychology Today reported, Ramirez once said of his fan base, "I think the girls are attracted to me because they can relate to me. The girls are nice when you're in my situation, but since I'm in here, I spend more time writing to them about the relationship rather than living it. But there are good friendships formed nevertheless." When Ramirez died in 2013, a San Quentin spokesperson told NBC that the Night Stalker received more fan mail than any other inmate on death row. Photos taken of Richard Ramirez just after his arrest are drastically different from those taken later in his life, and that's because he had his teeth fixed. Ramirez had missing and decaying teeth for some time, which were mentioned repeatedly by victims who often described the man who had attacked them. Police knew early on that they were looking for someone who had shaggy black hair and terrible teeth. Ramirez's teeth were instrumental in catching him too, when a trip to the dentist put him in the area where the murders took place. However, later pictures of Ramirez showed him sporting some newly pearly whites, and they reportedly took a lot of work. He had one root canal carried out, some of his teeth were filled with compounds, and his severe decay, which was caused by a lifetime of not brushing, eating sugary foods, and using cocaine, was also fixed. Cindy Hayden was one of the jurors in Richard Ramirez's trial. When one of her fellow jurors was killed in 1989, she told the Los Angeles Times, "My first thought was that we were all going to be picked off one by one. Who's next?" When she later appeared on Geraldo, she seemed to have changed her mind. When asked if she cared for Ramirez, she responded,
"Yes, I do. That's just one side of him."
The daughter of Ramirez's 10th and 11th official victims confronted Hayden on the show via a phone call and described in detail what had been done to her parents. When asked by the host how she could have feelings for a butcher, Hayden responded,
"I look beyond that. I look at what's behind that."
Hayden subsequently revealed that she believed Ramirez didn't get a fair trial. She also spent many of her days visiting him in jail. Hayden added that he was allegedly spending much of his time trying to understand why he had done the things he did. For history collection, Hayden was reportedly able to spend so much time with Ramirez because she had gotten her private investigator's license. This allowed her to accompany his defense team on visits, and also gave her some alone time with the killer she helped convict. Richard Ramirez never failed to attract fangirls. In 1990, KRON4 interviewed spectators at his trial, one of whom said,
"I just wanted to see what he looked like. I think he's cute."
In 1991, the El Paso Times reported that hundreds of women lined up for a chance to go behind bars to visit with Ramirez. At the time, security was shockingly lax. Not only did visitors not even have to share their names, but conversations weren't monitored or recorded. Sergeant Rich Dyer of the San Francisco Sheriff's Department explained to the publication, "They just ask for the prisoner they want to see, and when it's Ramirez, he always does see them. Their conversations aren't monitored, so we don't know what they talk about. A lot of them appear to be women who have never met him, but some have come back to visit some more." In those early days of his incarceration, Ramirez reportedly met with an average of around 8 to 10 women a week. Others were turned away simply because there wasn't enough time for them all. As one anonymous female visitor told SF-Gate, "He is good looking and I loved his big hands. The thrill of danger of going up to a state penitentiary made it all worth it because to me, it was like a dream come true to face one of the world's most feared men." Richard Ramirez found a bride among the flocks of women who visited him in prison. Doreen Leoy married Ramirez in 1996 while he was on death row. The pair tied the knot a few years after Leoy started sending Ramirez letters, a connection that started soon after his conviction. According to the Los Angeles Times, Leoy admitted to visiting Ramirez around 4 times a week and always taking breath mints with her so she could kiss with confidence. The year after they tied the knot, Leoy told CNN, "He's kind, he's funny, he's charming. I think he's really a great person. He's my best friend. He's my buddy." At the time, Leoy revealed she believed Ramirez was innocent and that she was willing to suffer the loneliness of being married to a man on death row if it meant she was with him. However, that seems to have changed after DNA evidence concretely tied Ramirez to the murder of 9-year-old May Leone. San Quentin spokesperson Lieutenant Sam Robinson told the Daily Beast that the Night Stalker had no visitors in the years leading up to his death, and the Sun suggested that Leoy stopped visiting her husband in 2009. A few months after Richard Ramirez died on death row, the New York Post spoke to an anonymous source who said, "Being incarcerated went against everything Ramirez was about. He hated being cooped up in a cell, but he valued his freedom to roam the streets and kill." According to the source, Ramirez first tried to put an escape plan into motion on September 21, 1993. At the time, he was traveling between San Quentin and a San Francisco court to face charges. When he was scanned with a handheld metal detector, it went off. Guards found that he had inserted a syringe, a ballpoint pen, a handcuff key, and a sticker into his rectal cavity. He was reportedly going to fake an illness to get sent to a hospital, which typically had much less security than the prison. The second escape attempt didn't occur until 1998. Authorities were apparently alerted to the escape attempt thanks to one of his many fan letters, which suggested he had a possible accomplice on the outside. This particular fan was immediately put on a restricted list, denying her access to the killer. In 2003, Metallica headed inside San Quentin for a 10-song concert for the prison inmates, per Rolling Stone. In an interview with NME in 2022, Kirk Hammett confirmed that Ramirez was a Metallica fan. Hammett found this out when he was given Ramirez's personal copy of a magazine with the band on the cover. According to the guards, Ramirez had been able to hear the concert from his cell on death row. However, he'd apparently been so outraged that he hadn't been allowed to watch the performance that he spent the whole time pacing back and forth. Hammett recalled to NME, "He hung out in Richmond, California, and I wonder sometimes if me and the guys from his earlier band were at the same parties as him back in the day." Richard Ramirez was sent to San Quentin in 1989 and was still being held there when he died in 2013. As prison spokesperson Lieutenant Sam Robinson told the Daily Beast, the Night Stalker's final years were lonely ones. Ramirez's access to other inmates and their visitors had been severely restricted in 2004 when he exposed himself to a young girl in the visitor's room. Despite having his privileges returned at some point, they were revoked again in 2007. By 2010, Ramirez had lost the privilege of having any personal visits whatsoever. Even after his visiting privileges were restored, Ramirez apparently started refusing all visitors, Robinson told the Daily Beast. He also wasn't allowed to come in contact with any other inmates on death row after a fight reportedly broke out in the prison yard in 2000. It would seem that Ramirez spent his final days alone in his cell with only his television for company. After Richard Ramirez died in 2013, the New York Post spoke with a source who had reportedly seen him in his last days and said, "He was the color green. He looked like a green highlighter pen. He was sitting up in his bed doing stretches." Following his death, Ramirez's autopsy revealed multiple illnesses. The one that killed him was B-cell lymphoma, per USA Today. The Marin County coroner also found that he was suffering from hepatitis C and complications from chronic substance abuse, which reportedly occurred prior to his incarceration.
The so-called Golden State Killer, also known as the East Area Rapist, terrorized California throughout the 1970s and 80s. By the time the notorious serial killer was caught in 2018, he was 72 years old. Joseph James D'Angelo Jr., a former police officer, confessed to the crimes he'd been connected to with DNA, ultimately pleading guilty to 13 murders and 13 kidnappings.
Investigators say that DNA was then plugged into the genealogy website.
If the statute of limitations hadn't expired, there would have been another 42 rapes, along with 161 additional counts of crimes like robbery, burglary, and attempted murder, per the Los Angeles Times. Despite his extensive crimes, D'Angelo didn't face the death penalty. Of this decision, Orange County District Attorney Todd Spitzer said via the Los Angeles Times, "What's so frustrating is that if anyone is the poster child for the death penalty, it's D'Angelo. Instead, D'Angelo was handed consecutive life sentences without parole." According to NBC News, the death penalty had been taken off the table in exchange for D'Angelo's confession. Prosecutors noted that getting D'Angelo to admit to the crimes was incredibly important, especially for survivors and family members of the victims. D'Angelo's age was also a consideration when it came to the death penalty. Given that D'Angelo was 74 years old at trial and it could take a whopping 30 to 35 years to go from trial to execution, it was likely he would die from old age on death row. Instead, it was decided that what life he had left would be spent behind bars, and families would get some much-needed closure. Neighbors seemed shocked when Joseph James D'Angelo Jr. was arrested at his home in April 2018. According to ABC News, he was taken into custody while law enforcement searched his house, looking for some of the items stolen from victims over the years.
Neighbors say D'Angelo was an average suburban homeowner.
Shortly after his arrest, Sacramento County Sheriff Scott Jones confirmed that D'Angelo was being held at the county jail in a psychiatric ward, per CBS News. Jones also added that D'Angelo was being kept under strict supervision, as he had also been put on suicide watch. More than 2 years had passed when it was reported that D'Angelo had entered his guilty plea with the courts, shedding a little more light on what had been going on behind closed doors. It transpired that D'Angelo blamed his crimes on an inner voice that he named Jerry. In an interrogation room following his arrest, D'Angelo reportedly said, per CBS News, "I didn't have the strength to push him out. He made me. He went with me. It was like in my head. I mean, he's a part of me. I didn't want to do those things. I pushed Jerry out and had a happy life. I did all those things. I destroyed all their lives. So now I've got to pay the price.
And I'm truly sorry."
When 74-year-old Joseph James D'Angelo Jr. appeared in court, the elderly man was visibly frail, using a wheelchair, and reportedly seemed weak and confused. As a result, many found it hard to believe that he was accused of some of the most horrific crimes in Californian history. According to retired Contra Costa County District Attorney investigator Paul Holes, D'Angelo often appeared catatonic while being questioned by police. However, according to Holes, the Golden State Killer was putting on an act. Holes explained per Oxygen, "Don't believe this guy that you see being wheeled into court. That's not who he is. He's the ultimate tactician, and his defense strategy is going to try and minimize what's going to happen to him."
I've listened to all your statements.
Holes also went on to describe D'Angelo as fit and active, something that Killer's neighbors substantiated, SFGate reported. After his conviction, the DA's office released some of the video footage of D'Angelo in his cell. Interestingly, it shows him doing things like exercising and climbing on furniture to reach things, which is far different from the image he presented in court. When Joseph James D'Angelo Jr. was handed a sentence of life behind bars, victims and their families appealed to the courts to have him locked away in a dark, distant place. Despite being united in the request, it was ultimately up to the state's corrections department to evaluate the Golden State Killer and decide where he should be incarcerated. Factors such as his age, notoriety, medical and mental health requirements, and the need for safety all impacted the decision. However, the decision regarding which prison would house D'Angelo took some time. In particular, the COVID-19 pandemic delayed matters and meant that the murderer was initially held in Sacramento County. At the time he was sentenced, the state had put to halt all transfers in hopes of stopping the spread of the virus through prison systems. It wasn't until November 2020, approximately 2.5 months after his sentencing, that D'Angelo was moved to North Kern State Prison, KCRA-NBC reported. However, that wasn't his final destination, but instead a reception center responsible for holding inmates while the final housing decisions were made. Early in February 2021, it was reported that Joseph James D'Angelo Jr. had been transferred to Corcoran State Prison. He was not, however, going to be housed with the prison's general population. KALW Public Radio got a rare inside look at the prison in 2013. At the time, it was home to around 12,000 inmates, making up half of the town's 24,000-person population. D'Angelo was set to be kept in a very small section inside the larger prison, called the Protective Housing Unit. It was revealed that the small unit contains approximately 20 cells. The unit is specifically for those deemed too notorious to live in the general population of the prison and who might become targets, or those who have committed particularly horrifying crimes. As an example, Charles Manson spent some time there. As revealed by KALW Public Radio's 2013 visit to Corcoran State Prison, the Protective Housing Unit where D'Angelo lives isn't easy to access. In fact, it's necessary to go through a series of gates, fences, barbed wire fences, more gates, and hallways with security cameras to reach the unit. Then, people must proceed to the Security Housing Unit, which is where the inmates deemed too dangerous to be allowed near others are kept. The building housing the Protective Housing Unit is next door. As reported by the Los Angeles Times, the only thing separating the two units is one remote-controlled door. The Protective Housing Unit is completely isolated and self-sufficient, with meals sent there by the prison's kitchens. Inside the building is a room outfitted with metal furniture. The concrete cells are a standard 8x12, and each has its own private toilet and sink, along with concrete beds, lighting, and shelving units. There's also a place to plug in electrical devices, as inmates are allowed televisions and radios in their cells. When a reporter from KALW Public Radio was escorted into the protective housing unit at Corcoran State Prison, one of the first things she saw was the outside yard. This featured boxing equipment, picnic tables, and a garden where inmates could grow their own vegetables. It was also revealed that inmates were allowed to go outside a few times a day, and that they had the place to themselves. As a result, Corcoran State Prison's protective housing unit is a far cry from one of the most dangerous prisons in the world. Prisoners in the unit are seemingly allowed a lot of freedom, with the ability to come and go from their cells as they please. They're also allowed to socialize with other inmates in the unit, which is considered their home. It's also worth mentioning that not everyone believes Corcoran State Prison to be an idyllic location for all inmates. In 1996, attorney Catherine Campbell filed a wrongful death lawsuit on behalf of the relatives of an inmate who was shot and killed at Corcoran State Prison, amid accusations of officer brutality. According to SFGate, she ultimately won the family an $825,000 settlement. Of the main prison, Campbell told the Los Angeles Times, "Corcoran is a nightmare. The people who work there don't consider themselves part of the legal system that controls and constrains the rest of us. It's an outlaw fortress." Meanwhile, Campbell described the protective housing unit where Joseph James D'Angelo Jr. lives as claustrophobic, saying, "I have never seen anything like it in all my years of going into prisons. You felt like you were walking into a benign mental health ward. It was not frightening. I have been more frightened by prisoners behind glass than by these prisoners. They seem so removed," so did Claude. However, conflicting accounts of Corcoran suggest that the prison isn't completely bleak. In 2005, Terry Thornton, a spokesperson for the Corrections Department, told the Los Angeles Times, "It's a quiet, well-behaved yard. They rarely have any incidents." According to Prison Law Project attorney Keith Watley, inmates regularly petition to get into the unit, especially if they've been attacked in their current environment. Watley says the screening process is long and intense, with many hoping to secure a spot in the very unit D'Angelo was assigned to. In 2005, attorney Catherine Campbell told the Los Angeles Times that Corcoran's protective housing unit was filled with all kinds of characters who've been tossed together in a weird mix of shared infamy and notoriety. However, it's also worth noting that there's no real way to tell who D'Angelo is sharing his space with, as the inmate list for Corcoran State Prison's protective housing unit is a closely guarded secret. In some cases, residents are reportedly housed in the unit because they have testified against other inmates, putting a target on their backs. Others are allegedly high-ranking gang members who may have people out to get them. When a reporter from KALW Public Radio went inside the unit, she was told that the identities of prisoners are kept secret. It also isn't widespread knowledge how many inmates are being held in the unit at one time, as safety is a top priority.
Theodore Robert Bundy is also one of the most infamous serial killers in the annals of American crime history. Although he admitted to murdering at least 36 women during a multi-state killing spree in the 1970s, experts believe he may have actually killed 100 or more. The former law school student would often lure his victims into death by pretending to be injured and using a cast, sling, or crutches. When his infamous and manipulative charm failed him, he would pose as a police officer or firefighter. Bundy was first arrested in 1975 after a high-speed chase by Highway Patrol Officer Bob Hayward. In 1976, he was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison for the attempted kidnapping of an 18-year-old from Salt Lake City, Utah in 1974. He made his first prison escape during a transfer from Utah to Colorado in 1977, but was soon recaptured. However, he had more success with his next escape attempt, which was also in 1977. Bundy made it to Tallahassee, Florida, where he went on another murder spree, killing 2 women at a sorority house near Florida State University and later a 12-year-old girl. He was arrested for the final time in 1978 and indicted on murder charges. Ultimately, he was convicted in 1979 and sentenced to death by electrocution the same year.
I'm not guilty.
During his years on death row, Ted Bundy received frequent visits from his wife, Carol Ann Boone. Bundy and Boone met while they were working at the Washington State Department of Emergency Services. At the time, they were both in relationships with other people. They eventually lost touch, but in 1977, they reconnected while Bundy was in jail in Utah. As the relationship blossomed, Boone moved to Florida to attend Bundy's trial for the murder of his 12-year-old victim, Kimberly Leach. Boone testified for Bundy as a character witness. In fact, Bundy and Boone got married in court during his trial, as she believed he was innocent.
Will you marry me?
Yes.
And I do hereby marry you.
Boone said that the guards allowed them to have sex, and she eventually became pregnant and gave birth to Rose Bundy in 1981, all while Bundy was on death row.
I don't think that Ted belongs in jail.
But as his execution date came closer, Bundy began to open up about his crimes. This prompted Boone to divorce him in 1986, as she realized that he was, in fact, not innocent. Bundy told FBI Special Agent Bill Hagmaier that he killed 30 people in 7 states between 1973 and 1978.
I deserve certainly the most extreme punishment society has.
At first, it seemed that Ted Bundy's time in prison did not affect him, but A&E reports that he spent his final night in prison in tears appealing to God. In an interview with psychologist and religious broadcaster James Dobson on the last night of his life, Bundy said that he took responsibility for his brutal crimes. Moreover, he prayed with a Methodist minister. In the hours before his death, Esquire reports that Bundy called his mother twice. At the end of the second call, she told Bundy, "You'll always be my precious son." According to A&E, he was given a final meal of steak, eggs, toast, and hash browns. He did not eat it. With this, a prison spokesperson noted, it appeared that he was accepting the finality of the situation. On January 24, 1989, Bundy made his way into the death chamber. He reportedly looked scared and apprehensive. An article from the Los Angeles Times notes that 42 people watched as he was placed into the electric chair. Once he was strapped in, he looked at his attorney and minister and said, "Jim and Fred, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." The Los Angeles Times writes that Bundy was then electrocuted with 2,000 volts of electricity. By 7:16 a.m., Ted Bundy was dead.
Bundy was executed before an atmosphere that was almost circus-like.
Bundy was then cremated, and his ashes were scattered over the Cascade Mountains.